By late August 1914, barely 3 weeks after the outbreak of the First World War, the Western Front had already devolved into a frantic cycle of forced marches, violent clashes, and bloody retreats. The peacetime plans built on confidence in speed, spirit, and near-mathematical precision were quickly shattered by the brutal realities of modern industrial war. Within this chaos, the Battle of Le Cateau emerged not as a carefully prepared engagement, but as the inevitable consequence of strategic setbacks, desperate decisions, and the gradual exhaustion of men pushed to their limits by the relentless pressure of the German war machine. After invading Belgium, the German army unleashed the massive right wing of the Schlieffen Plan, sweeping across the plains of northern France with the aim of encircling and destroying the French army while driving the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) off the continent. For Berlin, the arrival of British troops in Europe was a dangerous complication that had to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Although small compared to continental armies, the British were renowned for their discipline, rapid rifle fire, and professionalism, qualities the German High Command regarded with wary respect. The BEF, under Field Marshal Sir John French, had landed in France expecting to fight a well-coordinated, orderly mobile campaign alongside the French. Reality proved far harsher. At Mons on 23 August 1914, their first major encounter with the Germans, the British fought stubbornly, inflicting heavy casualties, but were ultimately forced into a controlled yet pressured retreat by overwhelming German numbers and artillery. From Mons began the Great Retreat, stretching hundreds of kilometers and testing the endurance of every soldier to the breaking point. In the days that followed, the British marched and fought in a constant rhythm of withdrawal under fire. Units faced unceasing pressure from the rapidly advancing German armies, particularly as communication with French forces broke down at times. Exhaustion set in. Heat, hunger, sleepless nights, and ceaseless marching left the BEF increasingly worn and fragmented. Many soldiers marched day and night under full kit, only to be thrown immediately into skirmishes as soon as they halted. Meanwhile, German successes fueled a growing momentum. The German First Army, commanded by Generaloberst Alexander von Kluck, pressed relentlessly forward, intent on crushing the BEF. For the German High Command, defeating the British would not only remove a capable adversary, but also deliver a psychological blow to the entire Entente coalition at the very outset of the war. By 25 August 1914, the BEF reached the area around Le Cateau, a rural region of northern France marked by open fields, scattered villages, and key road networks. It was far from an ideal defensive position, yet the exhausted Second Corps could no longer continue withdrawing without risking collapse. The distance between the British rearguard and the German vanguard was shrinking rapidly. Every hour increased the danger of the British being overtaken, broken apart, or enveloped. Inside the British command, tension reached a critical level. Frontline commanders understood that continued retreat in their current condition would lead to units disintegrating or being overwhelmed piecemeal. The High Command, however, wished to avoid a pitched battle fought under such unfavorable circumstances. Out of this conflict of necessity and strategy emerged the decision to fight at Le Cateau, not as a deliberate bid for victory, but as an act of survival, buying precious time for the rest of the BEF to slip away from the tightening German arc. For the ordinary British soldier, Le Cateau was no battlefield of glory. It was a place where they were forced to turn and face an enemy superior in numbers and artillery after days of exhausting withdrawal. Their fighting spirit remained, but it had been eroded by fatigue and the grim realization that they were standing on the edge of disaster. They understood that the coming battle would not be fought to win, but to hold on, to buy hours, perhaps even minutes, no matter the cost. Thus, the Battle of Le Cateau took shape in a uniquely tragic context. It was not the product of meticulous planning, but of strategic pressure, strained Allied coordination, and the overwhelming force of a German advance that seemed unstoppable. On the quiet, open fields of northern France, history was preparing to record one of the BEF's most desperate stands of the First World War, a battle in which human endurance would be pushed to its absolute limit. As the Battle of Le Cateau began on the 26th of August 1914, The two forces facing each other embodied two completely different conditions of the war unfolding on the Western Front. On one side stood the British Expeditionary Force, small in number, exhausted after days of continuous retreat, yet still maintaining the discipline and fighting spirit of a professional army. On the other side were the German armies at the height of their momentum, numerous, tightly organized, and driven forward by the relentless advance of the Schlieffen Plan. This imbalance set the stage for a confrontation that from the outset bore the unmistakable character of a desperate last stand. On the British side, the primary force engaged at Le Cateau was 2nd Corps of the BEF, commanded by Lieutenant General Horace Smith-Dorrien. 2 corps consisted of some of the finest British infantry divisions, most notably the 3rd and 5th Divisions, supported by several field artillery brigades. Before reaching Le Cateau, 2nd Corps had endured days of forced marches and repeated engagements since Mons, suffering significant casualties and, more critically, severe physical exhaustion. Many units were near breaking point, soldiers deprived of sleep, short on food, and marching under oppressive heat and swirling road dust. Smith-Dorrien himself was an experienced commander, a veteran of colonial campaigns, known for his realism and decisiveness. He clearly understood that 2nd Corps was in no condition to execute another immediate retreat under the pressure of the pursuing German armies. Attempting to fall back further risked turning the withdrawal into a disorganized collapse under artillery fire and infantry assault. Thus, despite overall instructions from Field Marshal Sir John French emphasizing the avoidance of a major engagement, Smith-Dorrien believed the only viable option was to stand and fight, to stabilize the line, delay the Germans, and buy time for the rest of the British forces to continue their retreat safely. British infantry were among the most skilled in Europe at the time. Armed with the Lee Enfield rifle, renowned for its rapid rate of fire and accuracy, well-trained soldiers could unleash a volume of fire so intense that German troops frequently mistook it for machine gun fire. British artillery, largely composed of light and medium field guns, was accurate but significantly outmatched in both range and numbers by German artillery. Moreover, the British possessed far fewer machine guns than their opponents, limiting their ability to withstand large-scale assaults. A major weakness in British preparations was the defensive position itself. Le Cateau was dominated by open fields, scattered villages, and roads running parallel to the German axis of advance. The terrain provided little natural cover, forcing British troops to dig shallow trenches in haste while under pressure from approaching enemy formations. With minimal time to fortify their positions, British defenses were shallow, temporary, and highly vulnerable to concentrated German artillery fire. On the opposite side, the Germans deployed elements of the First Army, commanded by Generaloberst Alexander von Kluck, along with portions of the Second Army under Generaloberst Karl von Bülow. These formations were the spearhead of Germany's massive right wing, advancing rapidly through northern France. German numbers at Le Cateau far exceeded those of the British, and their forces, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, were tightly structured and maintained high combat readiness thanks to efficient logistics and coordination. Von Kluck was an aggressive, energetic commander who relentlessly pushed his units forward in hopes of destroying the BEF before it could slip away. In his view, the exhausted and partially isolated 2nd Corps presented an ideal target, a vulnerable force occupying an inferior defensive position. The Germans had no intention of delaying. They prepared instead for a decisive frontal assault supported heavily by artillery. German equipment reflected the advantages of a fully industrialized military power. Their infantry carried Mauser-Gewehr 98 rifles and possessed a far greater density of Maxim MG-08 machine guns than the British. German artillery, both field and heavy batteries, held a decisive edge in range, volume, and destructive capability, perfectly suited for the open terrain around Le Cateau. Well-trained cooperation between German infantry and artillery enabled them to suppress defensive positions before launching their assaults. Tactically, the Germans entered the battle with complete initiative. Their reconnaissance had already identified the approximate British dispositions, and their marching columns and supply lines remained intact and unimpeded. The British, by contrast, were forced to prepare for battle while simultaneously retreating, digging trenches, and organizing a defensive line, all in an extremely compressed time frame. This disparity tilted the balance sharply in Germany's favor even before the first shots were fired. Yet what makes the Battle of Le Cateau truly remarkable lies not only in the disparity of forces, but in the stark contrast of morale and purpose. The Germans entered the fight with unshakable confidence, certain that they were about to crush a weakened adversary. The British, on the other hand, fought with full awareness that they were standing to hold, not to win, fighting for time, for survival, and for the lives of the rest of their army. This desperate resolve, combined with the discipline and skill of a professional force, formed the foundation of one of the most heroic defensive actions the British Expeditionary Force would undertake in the opening weeks of the First World War. At dawn on the 26th of August, 1914, with a thin mist still lying over the open fields surrounding Le Cateau, the battle began in an atmosphere of crushing fatigue and grim resignation. There were no rallying cries, no grand preparations typical of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Instead, the opening phase of the Battle of Le Cateau unfolded as an act of forced survival, a moment when British units were compelled to turn and face an enemy closing in by the hour, even as their bodies and spirits had been drained by the relentless Great Retreat from Mons. Lieutenant General Horace Smith Dorrien's Second Corps deployed a defensive line stretching several kilometers across the scattered villages and bare fields around Le Cateau. British infantry dug shallow trenches through the night, making use of any ridge, embankment, or farm structure that could provide even a hint of shelter from enemy artillery. The deployment took place under poor light, with little accurate intelligence on German positions, and virtually no time to construct a defense in depth. The resulting line was clearly improvised, yet it was the only option left to prevent total collapse during the retreat. By early morning, German artillery opened fire. The first shells crashed into suspected British positions, marking the formal start of the battle. With their longer range and superior numbers, German guns quickly dominated the field. The shallow British trenches offered little protection from shrapnel or blast pressure. Many units took casualties in the very first minutes, before they could even settle into their firing positions. German infantry of Alexander von Kluck's First Army advanced behind the creeping barrage in organized formations, probing forward and closing in on the British line. German reconnaissance soon confirmed that the British were holding a thin, temporary, overstretched front. This encouraged the German command to intensify the pressure, viewing Le Cateau as an opportunity to destroy two corps, the most isolated and exhausted formation of the entire British Expeditionary Force. The British responded with the most potent weapon they still possessed: disciplined, rapid, and accurate rifle fire. Despite their exhaustion, British soldiers employed the fast-fire drills perfected in peacetime. Bursts of Lee-Enfield fire swept across the open ground, creating dense walls of bullets. In several sectors, German infantry were halted and forced to lie flat or seek cover as the deadly precision of British riflemen inflicted heavy casualties. But this advantage could not last. German artillery continuously adjusted its fire, concentrating on exposed British positions. Field guns and heavy batteries methodically shattered trenches, disrupted communications, and made the resupply of ammunition increasingly difficult. Many British guns, positioned forward to support the infantry, were spotted and quickly targeted by German counter-battery fire. During these opening hours, the Battle of Le Cateau resembled a struggle between overwhelming artillery power and defensive skill at the individual level. The British held their line through discipline and the fighting ability of small units. Yet, as the hours passed, fatigue and losses mounted. Junior officers were forced to shift positions constantly, patch holes in the line, and rally their men, even as they themselves were worn down to the edge of collapse. For British soldiers in the front line, the early phase of the battle felt like an extension of the nightmare of retreat, now transformed into a desperate defensive stand. They fought with little water, insufficient food, and in many cases without sleep for days. The relentless explosions, the spray of earth, and the sight of comrades falling beside them blurred their sense of time and place. Yet they held on, not out of expectation of victory, but because they understood that behind them were units still retreating. And if this line broke too soon, the consequences would be catastrophic. On the German side, the opening stage of the battle was not as smooth as anticipated. Though superior in numbers and firepower, they faced fierce and highly accurate British resistance. Many German units were slowed or pinned down by British rifle fire, forcing their artillery to continue the painstaking task of crushing one position after another before infantry could advance safely. This kept the German pace below what their commanders hoped for. Thus, the early phase of the Battle of Le Cateau did not end with a decisive breakthrough, but with a bloody stalemate of attrition. The British still held their original line, at a mounting cost. The Germans intensified their pressure, bringing up additional guns and infantry in preparation for stronger assaults. Across the fields around Le Cateau, smoke, dust, and shell bursts thickened the sky, signaling that the worst hours of the battle were yet to come. Hours in which the endurance of the British soldier would be tested to its absolute limit. As the sun climbed higher over Le Cateau on the 26th of August 1914, the battle entered its most brutal phase, a point at which every limit of endurance, morale, and cohesion within the British Expeditionary Force was pushed to the brink of collapse. As the morning mist lifted, it revealed the full extent of the British Second Corps' fragile defensive line stretched across the open farmland. This was the moment the battle shifted decisively. No longer groping through obscured terrain, the Germans could now bring overwhelming firepower to bear on fully exposed positions. German artillery began firing with a ferocity unmatched in the earlier hours. Shell after shell crashed into the British line, blowing apart shallow trenches, collapsing earthen banks, and turning improvised shelters into deadly traps. Explosions tore gaps in the defensive front, scattering metal and soil and severing communication between units. In many sectors, officers were wounded or killed outright, forcing NCOs and enlisted men to organize resistance on their own amid chaos and incomplete information. At the front, German infantry launched larger and more coordinated assaults. Advancing methodically behind their barrage, German regiments pushed across the open fields, closing steadily on the British trenches. Maxim machine guns were positioned to dominate the terrain, laying down suppressive fire that crushed any attempt by the British to counterattack or realign their defenses. Under the combined pressure of direct and indirect fire, the British line was eroded yard by yard, not by a single decisive blow, but by an unrelenting grind. The British fought back desperately, yet with remarkable determination. Exhausted soldiers under constant bombardment still maintained disciplined rifle fire. Lee Enfields crackled with rapid volleys, turning German advances into bloody scenes of halting progress. Some German units were stopped short of the trench line, forced to flatten themselves against the earth to escape the ruthless accuracy of British riflemen. For a brief time, British musketry still carved deadly gaps into German formations, exacting a toll for every forward step. But courage could not overturn the imbalance. German artillery continuously refined its aim, pounding the stiffest pockets of resistance with punishing precision. British guns, crucial pillars of the defense, were gradually destroyed, overrun, or forced to withdraw once ammunition ran short or their positions were exposed. As British artillery fell silent, the infantry at the front found themselves increasingly unprotected against the full weight of German fire. The climax of the battle was also the moment when British lines began to unravel, not through lack of bravery, but because the situation had become untenable. Many units were isolated from one another, communications were shattered, and soldiers fought in small clusters, trench by trench, without coordinated orders from above. Every decision, whether to hold or withdraw, whether to stay one more minute or abandon a position, had life or death consequences for entire companies. For the British soldier, the height of the battle was a blur of instinct and responsibility colliding violently. They saw comrades fall beside them, many wounded beyond rescue in the midst of non-stop shelling. There was no time to evacuate casualties or bury the dead. Cries of pain mixed with the roar of explosions, forming a grim tableau of desperation and sacrifice. And yet, many units held on to the last possible moment, knowing each hour purchased was another hour for the rest of the British Army to escape encirclement. The Germans, despite their overwhelming advantage, also paid heavily during this peak of combat. Advancing across exposed ground under precise British rifle fire inflicted heavy casualties. German infantry moved in fits and starts, lying prone, rising again under fire, watching comrades fall just steps away. The difference was that behind them, German artillery continued clearing the path, ensuring that the overall pressure never relented. By early afternoon, the situation of Second Corps had become critical. Many defensive positions were breached or no longer capable of holding. Faced with the threat of complete encirclement, Lieutenant General Horace Smith Dorrien made the hardest decision of the day: to begin a fighting withdrawal, abandoning the field gradually while still maintaining enough resistance to protect the retreat. This was the moment when the Battle of Le Cateau reached its tragic zenith, where defense and retreat fused into one under fire. British units pulled back under furious bombardment, often forced to abandon artillery and heavy equipment simply because they could no longer move it. Guns were left behind not for lack of resolve, but because horses had been killed or wounded, and the roads were under German fire. Infantry covered each other's withdrawal, small groups holding and falling back in turn. Quiet, decisive acts of sacrifice that made the retreat possible. The climax of Le Cateau did not end in a sudden collapse, but in a slow, grinding disintegration that could not be reversed. The British line broke in segments, yet never dissolved into total disorder. Amid fire and smoke, the discipline of a professional army held just long enough to salvage what could be saved, though at a devastating cost. It was in these hours that Le Cateau etched itself into history as a symbol of desperate resistance. Not a victory, not even a clear tactical success, but a testament to human endurance under overwhelming force. On the blood-soaked fields around Le Cateau, British soldiers fought not to win, but to give their army a chance to live on, transforming their sacrifice into the foundation for the next turning points of the war on the Western Front. As late afternoon fell over the fields around Le Cateau on the 26th of August 1914, the battle drew to a close in a state of exhaustion, devastation, and a heavy silence lingering after the storm of fire. Gunfire tapered off, giving way to drifting smoke and churned up earth where bodies, abandoned equipment, and shattered guns lay scattered, mute and painful evidence of a day fought in utter desperation. Le Cateau did not end with victory in the traditional sense, but its outcome carried vital meaning for the British Expeditionary Force in the opening weeks of the First World War. Tactically, Le Cateau was a defeat for the British. The thin defensive line of Second Corps could not withstand the overwhelming German superiority in artillery and manpower. British units were forced to withdraw, leaving behind field guns and heavy equipment they could no longer move under the fierce bombardment. Yet to judge Le Cateau solely in terms of win or loss is to miss its true significance. The day-long stand of Second Corps achieved the single most important objective: slowing the German pursuit, disrupting their momentum, and buying precious time for the rest of the British Expeditionary Force to retreat safely to the south. Lieutenant General Horace Smith Dorrien, who had decided to stand and fight contrary to the original intentions of GHQ, faced criticism in the immediate aftermath. But events soon proved that his decision had been necessary. Had two corps continued withdrawing in its exhausted, closely pressed state, it risked being destroyed piecemeal or encircled entirely. Le Cateau, though a tactical defeat, became a strategic salvation for the British Army on the Western Front. Casualties reflected the brutality of the fighting and the vast disparity between the two sides. The British suffered heavily, thousands killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. Some infantry units were decimated, reduced to fragments of their former strength. Entire companies emerged almost incapable of further combat. British artillery suffered greatly as well, with many guns destroyed or captured during the withdrawal. These losses were not merely numerical. They struck at the morale of a force already worn down by days of continuous retreat. The Germans, though victorious, also paid a steep price. Their frontal advances under the precise rifle fire of British infantry caused casualties far higher than expected, especially in the morning and midday phases when they were forced to cross open ground against stubborn resistance. These losses, while not altering the tactical outcome, contributed to slowing the tempo of the German right wing, an unwelcome development for the high command in Berlin during the critical execution of the Schlieffen Plan. Morally, Le Cateau left a profound imprint on both sides. For the British survivors, the memory of a day fought in hopeless circumstances. holding not out of expectation of victory, but out of duty and necessity, became an inseparable part of their wartime experience. They left Le Cateau exhausted, but with the knowledge that their sacrifice had mattered. The battle helped cement the image of the British Army as a small but tenacious force, capable of standing firm against overwhelming odds. For the Germans, Le Cateau was a victory, but not an easy one. It demonstrated that the British Expeditionary Force, even when forced into a defensive stand, remained a dangerous opponent capable of inflicting serious losses. This realization compelled German commanders to treat the BEF with greater caution in the days that followed, as they continued their pursuit during the final phase of the Great Retreat. Historically, Le Cateau holds a distinctive place in the opening phase of the Western Front. Alongside Mons, it became one of the defining early defensive battles fought by the British on the continent. More importantly, Le Cateau played a direct role in ensuring the survival of the British Expeditionary Force, allowing it to regroup and fight again in the decisive Battle of the Marne in early September, where the German advance was finally stopped. The battle also starkly revealed the nature of modern warfare. The shallow trenches, the abandoned guns, the units fighting to the point of collapse on open ground, all showed that individual bravery, however admirable, was no match for the destructive power of industrialized artillery and massed firepower. Le Cateau was not the birthplace of trench warfare, but it was one of the earliest signs that the romantic maneuver warfare of the 19th century was giving way to a far more protracted and brutal struggle. When night finally fell, Le Cateau outwardly returned to the quiet of the French countryside, but the land bore scars that would never fully fade. Beneath those fields lay the memory of a day when British soldiers held out in utter desperation, not to claim victory, but to preserve the life of an entire army. It was this silent sacrifice that made Le Cateau one of the most tragic and heroic chapters in the history of the British Expeditionary Force during the First World War. A reminder of the terrible price paid when history is written in blood and fire. The Battle of Le Cateau in 1914 did not end with a triumphant chorus, but with the heavy silence of fields stained with smoke and blood. In a single day of desperate fighting, British soldiers held their ground against the crushing pressure of the German war machine, not to win a glorious victory, but to buy time and ensure the survival of the entire British Expeditionary Force. Le Cateau became a symbol of quiet sacrifice, where discipline, courage, and a profound sense of duty kept an army from being swept away in the first great storm of 20th century warfare. How do you feel about the Battle of Le Cateau and the tragic, resolute stand made by those British soldiers under almost hopeless conditions? What leaves the strongest impression on you? The commander's decision to stand and fight, or the unwavering endurance of the men on the front line? If you find this content meaningful and rich in historical insight, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow us as we continue exploring the brutal battles that shaped the First World War and the course of modern history.